Rachel stopped in the doorway with her hand still on the knob and forgot how to breathe. Ranger was on the bed, chest pressed to the chest of the folded uniform, his heavy head resting exactly where a heartbeat should have been. He did not lift his eyes. He only pushed his nose deeper into the dark wool and let out a thin sound she had never heard a dog make. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments what corner of the world you are listening from and hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this one. The bedroom smelled the way it had always smelled, cedar from the drawer liners and the last ghost of David's aftershave, and for a moment Rachel Cooper thought she might turn around and walk out and pretend she had not seen. If she walked out, the morning could still be the morning she had planned. She would drive to the elementary school. She would pick up Paige. She would come home and let the base liaison into the living room, hand him the uniform in a garment bag, and sign the memorial paperwork with a steady pen. She would not have to look at the black Labrador on the bed pressing his ribs into wool that would never fill out with a chest again. She did not walk out. She crossed the carpet on socked feet, sat down at the edge of the mattress, and laid her hand on Ranger's flank. He was warm. He was breathing in that slow, deliberate way he had learned from David, the count he was taught to keep when a person was upset: 4 in, hold for 2, 6 out, over and over, until the person copied him without knowing. Rachel copied him without knowing. Her shoulders came down half an inch. Her eyes closed. The tears came out of her, the way water comes out of a rag when someone finally squeezes it. "You knew before I did," she whispered. "You always knew before I did." Ranger's tail moved once against the folded cuffs of the trouser leg, a single acknowledgement, and settled again. His dark eyes stayed fixed on her face the way they had been fixed on David's face in every photograph she owned. He did not lick her. He did not paw at her. He only breathed, and after a while she found that she was breathing with him, and the sob that had been trying to break out of her chest for 6 weeks slid out sideways, quiet, small, and human. She would remember this moment later, when everything else had been taken apart and put back together. She would remember that her first instinct had been to leave. She would remember that a 70-pound dog with graying whiskers had been the one who taught her, without a single spoken word, how to stay. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a beige building on Great Neck Road, less than 4 miles from the front gate at Little Creek, close enough that on quiet nights Rachel could hear the distant thrum of a Zodiac cutting across Broad Bay. She had chosen it for that reason, back when David was between deployments and they were saving for a down payment on a real house. It had 2 bedrooms, a galley kitchen, a balcony the width of a bath mat, and a landlord named Wesley Grant, who spoke to her in the same tone whether she was late with rent or bringing him a Christmas card. Everything about that apartment had been temporary. Everything had been for later. Later, they would have the yard with the wooden fence. Later, they would have a mudroom for wet paws and salt-crusted boots. Later, Paige would have a bedroom painted the specific shade of sea glass green David had promised her the summer she turned 5. Later, Rachel had signed a 2-year lease because David was going to be gone for most of the first year and half of the second, and later would come when he came home for good. He came home in a flag-draped box on a Tuesday in early May and later ended. The chaplain had come to the door at 10 minutes past 7 in the morning. Rachel had been standing at the counter in her robe, waiting for the coffee maker to finish its slow gurgle, and she had known before she opened the door. Ranger had known too. He had been at the front door for 11 straight days by then, sitting up every time a car engine slowed on the street, dropping his head every time it kept going. When the chaplain knocked, Ranger did not move. He looked at the door, then looked at Rachel, and then lay down flat on the tile with his chin on his paws. The dog had already grieved a version of David that Rachel had not yet allowed herself to picture. The chaplain's name was Kenneth Boyle, a Navy captain with silver hair cropped close and a wedding ring worn thin at the shank. He said the words in the correct order: "Combat operations, extraction under fire, your husband, I am very sorry. He offered to make a phone call to whoever she needed. He offered water. He offered to stay. Rachel remembered nodding at things and not remembering what she had nodded at. She remembered that Paige, who was 7, had come out of her room in her pajamas and stopped in the hallway with her stuffed narwhal against her cheek, and Rachel had crossed the room and lifted her without thinking and held her against her chest so hard that when she finally set the girl down, there were faint red marks where her fingers had pressed too long. She remembered Ranger walking a slow circle around them both and then lying down at their feet as close as he could get without being on top of them, and staying there for 6 hours. The first week after was a fog. The second was a paperwork storm. There were forms in triplicate, insurance calls, phone calls from people who had loved David and people who had barely known him. And by the third week, Rachel had started measuring her days by what needed to be signed by the end of them. Ranger stopped eating on day 9. He would drink water. He would go outside when she took him. He would come back and lie in the entryway with his nose against the door and refuse the bowl she set beside him. She read that dogs could go without food for a while when they were grieving, that it was not usually dangerous. On day 12, she cooked chicken for him and hand-fed him strips off her fingers, and he ate because she asked him to, not because he wanted it. The neighbor came on day 15. His name was Douglas Vance, and he lived directly below them. He was in his late 50s, unmarried, a shift worker at the container terminal down at Norfolk International Terminals, and he had complained about the sound of Paige's tap shoes on the kitchen floor twice already in the 18 months they had lived above him. He knocked at 9 in the evening, with his shoulders squared, and a piece of paper in his hand, and told Rachel that the dog had howled from midnight until 2 in the morning for 3 nights running. He said he had recorded it. He said he had sent the recording to the landlord. He said he was very sorry for her loss, in the flat tone of a man reading a card he did not choose, and then he said that his sleep was his health and his health was his job. And if the dog was going to keep howling, he was going to file a formal complaint under the lease. Rachel stood at her own door, with the pull chain of her hallway light dangling behind her head, and could not think of a single thing to say. She said thank you, which was a word people said when they had not yet decided what they felt. She closed the door and put her back against it and slid to the floor, and Ranger came and sat beside her and pressed his shoulder into her ribs and stayed there until Paige came out of her room asking for a glass of water. The next morning, Wesley Grant, the landlord, called and confirmed a formal warning. Weight limit in the lease was 50 pounds. Ranger was 72. She had signed the lease before adopting the dog, which meant nothing legally except that David had assumed, and Rachel had assumed, that a dog belonging to an active duty service member with a documented working history on base would be treated the way service dogs were treated everywhere, which was to say invisibly. That assumption had not been formalized on paper. Wesley Grant did not care about assumptions. He cared about weight limits. He said she had 30 days to bring the household into compliance with the lease. Rachel wrote the date on the kitchen calendar with a red pen, and the pen slipped, and the red mark ran off the square and up the wall of the calendar page like a small, bright wound. That was when Wendy came. Wendy was Rachel's older sister by 3 years, married to an electrician named Craig, mother of 2 boys who called her Mom in the tone of children who had learned early that Mom was safer than anything else. Wendy lived in a 4-bedroom colonial in Chesapeake with a fenced backyard and an in-ground pool, and she had opinions the way other people had hobbies. She arrived on the Saturday after the landlord's call carrying a casserole and a legal pad and a plan. "You need to think about this practically," she said, setting the casserole down without waiting to be told where. "You have a job to keep. You have a child to raise. You cannot keep a dog that size in a second-floor apartment where the neighbors are already writing you up. This is not a discussion about feelings. This is a discussion about survival." "He was David's dog," Rachel said. "He was David's dog," Wendy agreed, in the voice of a woman conceding a small factual point on her way to a larger conclusion. And David is not here. And you have to make choices that David would not have wanted to make. That is what being the one still standing means. There are rescues that will take a Labrador of any age. There are farms upstate that specialize in retired working dogs. I can make the calls. You do not even have to be part of the process. You just have to say yes. Rachel did not say yes. She did not say no. She said she would think about it. Ranger lay under the kitchen table the entire time Wendy was in the apartment and did not raise his head until she left. And then he came out from under the table and put his chin on Rachel's knee and looked up at her the way he had looked up at David the day David had come home from a 9-month tour, and dropped his sea bag in the entryway and gone straight to the floor to hold the dog with both hands. That night Rachel lay awake and listened to the refrigerator hum and thought about her sister's plan, and thought about Douglas Vance downstairs with his recorder, and thought about her mother-in-law Linda, who had called 3 days after the funeral to say, gently but firmly, that a dog ranger's size needed land, not a walk-up, and had Rachel considered the boarding kennel outside Suffolk that Linda's cousin ran. Rachel had said she would consider it. She had considered many things she did not intend to do. She had learned, in the 6 weeks since the chaplain had come to the door, that the world sent people to her with plans, and none of the plans included the possibility that she might already know what she wanted. But she did not know what she wanted. That was the problem. She wanted David. She wanted the house they had not bought. She wanted the fenced yard and the mudroom and the sea glass green paint. She wanted a version of her life that had ended on the 2nd Tuesday of May. And in the absence of what she wanted, she could not tell what she was willing to lose next. She was 1 bad week away from calling Wendy back and saying yes. Then she found the notebook. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Paige was at a birthday party for a girl in her 2nd grade class, and Rachel had promised herself, for the 3rd weekend running, that she would open David's deployment bag. The bag had been on the floor of the closet since May, unopened, because opening it required a version of Rachel that could go through her husband's things and remain standing on the other side. She sat on the closet floor with the bag between her knees and unzipped it slowly, tooth by tooth, the way you unwrap something you're afraid to break. There was a rolled desert tan t-shirt on top that still held the shape of his shoulder. There was a bottle of the specific hot sauce he carried everywhere because he claimed base food was insulting without it. There was a pair of boots caked with fine pale dust that Rachel could not bring herself to knock off. There was a leather bracelet Paige had made him at day camp the summer before, still knotted with the shell she had drilled through with a hobby Dremel. And underneath everything, wedged along the spine of the bag, there was a plain black composition notebook of the kind sold at every drugstore in the country for $2.39. Rachel opened it on her knees on the closet floor. The first 2/3 of the notebook were David's field notes, technical, precise, dated in his tight, square handwriting, and largely unreadable to a civilian. Coordinates, timings, equipment observations, 2 pages of what looked like a loadout list for cold water insertion, a page of nothing but questions he had wanted to ask his team chief about a piece of gear that had failed a swim test. She turned pages carefully, aware that she was reading something that had been meant for other men in other rooms. And then, on a page dated the 6th of March, the handwriting changed. It slanted the way it always did when he was writing to her personally, and at the top of the page he had written her name, just her name, Rachel, and beneath it 4 full pages of a letter she had not known existed. She read them once through, and then she got up and closed the bedroom door and sat down at the edge of the bed and read them again. He apologized first. He apologized for the trip to Michigan that he had missed the year Paige turned 4. He apologized for the anniversary he had spent on a rock in the middle of the ocean, unable to send a message and unable to tell her he had tried. He apologized for the nights when the silence of him not being there had been the loudest thing in her house. He said he knew he had missed things that could not be given back, and he did not ask for forgiveness for them, only recognition that he had known. He said he had been thinking about Ranger. He said that the dog was not a pet, the way other dogs were pets. He said Ranger had come out of a working line and had been evaluated for water work and search, and had ended up with them because he had failed a single hearing test as a puppy that later turned out to be a false positive. And by the time the trainer realized the mistake, David had already put a deposit down and taken him home. He said the dog had spent the 2 deployments at the foot of his bunk. He said the dog had learned things on his own that most therapy animals took months to be taught. He said that when Rachel had cried the night before, David had left for the last deployment, quietly in the bathroom with the water running so Paige would not hear. Ranger had scratched at the door until David had let him in, and the dog had put his head across Rachel's lap without being told, and had breathed the 4-2-6 pattern until she copied him. David wrote that he had made a decision in the tent that night after he had put Ranger back in the vehicle. He had signed the dog up for the therapy certification program that the base family support ran for spouses of active duty personnel. He had done 3 of the 6 evaluation appointments during his leave when Rachel thought he was going to physical therapy for his shoulder. He had done them because he wanted to know that if something happened to him, there would be a shape in the house that could sit with her when the shape of him was gone. He said, and here Rachel had to put the notebook down and pick it up again 3 times, that he had trained Ranger for months on a specific command. He had taught the dog to find her when she cried, not to bark, not to alert, just to find her, wherever she was in the house, and to lie down against her body and breathe until she copied him. At the bottom of the 4th page, in slightly larger letters, he had written the phone number of a woman named Yolanda Ruiz at the family support office, and beside it, in parentheses, the words, "she knows." Rachel closed the notebook and put it on the bed and got up and walked to the door of the bedroom and stopped, because Ranger was already there. He was in the doorway, sitting up straight the way he had been trained to sit at attention. He had not been in the room when she opened the bag. He had been in the living room with a rawhide, and she had heard him chewing on it. He was in the doorway now, because at some point in the last 20 minutes she had started to cry, and she had not noticed, and he had noticed, and he had come. She sat down on the floor with her back to the wall, and Ranger came and lay down across her thighs so that most of his weight was on her legs, and put his chin on her sternum and breathed. 4 in, hold 2, 6 out, 4 in, hold 2, 6 out. Rachel put her hand on the top of his head and felt the shape of his skull under her palm, and cried until she could feel the wetness of her own tears through the collar of her shirt. And Ranger breathed, and did not move, and did not move, and did not move. She called Yolanda Ruiz on Monday morning at 8:15. Yolanda had a warm voice and a fast typing sound in the background, and the practiced patience of a woman who had told grieving families the same information many times without ever making it sound rehearsed. She said yes. She remembered David. She said yes. She had the file. She said that David had completed 3 of the 6 certification sessions, and that the remaining 3, plus a formal home evaluation and a behavior assessment, could be completed by a surviving spouse under the family transition provision. She said that the entire process, expedited, could take 4 weeks. She said that a properly certified psychiatric service dog carried federal housing protections that overrode most standard weight and breed restrictions in a residential lease, provided documentation was submitted properly and within reasonable timeframes. Rachel wrote down every word. Then Yolanda paused, and Rachel could hear her turning pages, and Yolanda asked very carefully if Rachel was aware that a second complaint had been filed by her landlord in the last 72 hours. Rachel was not aware. Yolanda read the complaint out loud. Wesley Grant had escalated the notice from a warning to an intent to terminate. The clock was no longer 30 days, it was 14. If Ranger was not certified and documentation was not on file within 14 days, the lease would be voided and eviction proceedings would begin. Rachel held the receiver against her ear and stared at the calendar on the wall with the red pen streak running off the square, and for a full 7 seconds she did not breathe. Then she said, in a voice that surprised her because it was steadier than she felt, "When can we start?" Yolanda said, "How is tomorrow morning at 9? Rachel said, "I will be there." She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table. She put both palms flat on the wood and pressed. She looked at the red streak on the calendar, and she looked at the notebook where she had set it beside the fruit bowl, and she thought about David sitting somewhere in a tent on the other side of the world, writing 4 pages of instructions to a wife he was going to leave a widow. And she thought about the dog in the doorway of the bedroom who had breathed with her without being told. And she thought out loud into the empty kitchen, all right, David." She looked down, and Ranger was already there. He had come to the table without being called. He put his chin on her knee and looked up at her, and she saw for the first time, in the specific angle of his ears and the steadiness of his eyes, that this dog had been given a job. And he had been doing the job. And he had been doing it since the morning of the 2nd Tuesday of May. She did not know yet that the 14 days would turn into 100 other things. She did not know yet that her sister Wendy had already spoken to Wesley Grant twice on her own, without telling Rachel, and had told him that the family fully supported his enforcement of the lease. She did not know yet that her mother-in-law Linda had been shown the notebook once, back in March, and had never mentioned it to Rachel. She did not know yet that a man from David's team named Marcus Delaney was going to show up at her door in 9 days with a manila envelope he had promised David he would not open, and that what was inside it would change the way Rachel understood the last 3 months of her husband's life. She did not know yet that Paige had been getting up in the middle of the night for 2 weeks and walking into the living room and sitting on the floor beside the front door and waiting for her father to come home, and that Ranger had been sleeping in the hallway between them without being asked because he had figured out on his own that both of them were breaking and neither of them was telling the other. She did not know any of that yet. She only knew that the dog was on the bed and the uniform was under him and the notebook was in her hand, and there were 14 days on a calendar with a red streak on it. And for the first time since the chaplain had knocked on her door, she had something to do. She stood up. The first training session was at the Little Creek Family Support Building at 9 in the morning. Rachel drove there with Ranger in the back seat, wearing a plain blue harness the therapy program had mailed her, and she checked the address 3 times on her phone at 3 separate stoplights because she did not entirely trust that her hands were doing what she thought they were doing. Yolanda Ruiz met her at the door, a compact woman in her 40s with silver hoop earrings and a laminated ID clipped to a lanyard printed with tiny pineapples. She led Rachel and Ranger down a hallway that smelled of industrial floor wax and coffee, past a bulletin board layered 5 deep in photos of dogs in vests, and into a room the size of a 2-car garage with mats on the floor and windows along one wall. The trainer was a retired hospital corpsman named Erin Bishop. She was older than Rachel had expected, in her early 60s, with a long grey braid down her back and hands scarred in the particular way of women who had worked with animals their whole lives. Erin did not shake Rachel's hand first. She crouched down, low and easy, and let Ranger come to her, and when he touched his nose to her wrist, she stayed still and let him decide when to lift his head. "Well," Erin said, still crouched, "this one has been working since he was old enough to work. You did not raise a pet, Mrs. Cooper." "He was David's," Rachel said. And then, because she had said it 100 times in the past 6 weeks and it always came out the same way, she braced for the small, sympathetic silence that always followed. Erin did not do the silence. Erin looked up at her and nodded once, plain and quick, and said, "David built a good dog. Let us see what he built." For the next 2 hours, Erin ran Ranger through a series of small tests, and Rachel watched a dog she thought she had known do things she had never seen. Ranger sat on command, which she had known. Ranger stayed on command through a series of distractions which she had suspected. Ranger, when Erin whispered a specific 2-syllable word Rachel did not catch, walked directly across the room to Rachel, sat down against her left leg, leaned his shoulder into her calf, and did not move until Erin whistled him off. When Erin dropped a set of car keys on the tile floor behind Rachel to make her flinch, Ranger was already in front of her, chest to her shins, before the keys had finished bouncing. When Erin asked Rachel to hold her breath for a count of 10, and then exhale sharply, the way a person does when they are about to cry, Ranger circled once around her and put his head across her thigh and started the 4-2-6 pattern without any signal at all. "He knows the breath," Erin said. "He knows the breath," Rachel repeated. "Your husband taught him to lead the count," Erin said. "He is going to find you and he is going to give you the pattern, and if you copy the pattern, you will settle. That is his whole job. Everything else is decoration." Rachel sat down on one of the mats because her legs had suddenly become unreliable, and Ranger came and sat against her hip and looked up at Erin. Erin took a plastic clipboard off a hook on the wall and made 3 neat check marks on a form and said, "He has already passed the parts of the certification that take most dogs the longest. What is left is paperwork and 1 field evaluation. If nothing goes sideways, we can have his card in your hand in 3 weeks. "I need it in 2, Rachel said. Erin looked at her for a long second. Then she said, "The landlord." "The landlord," Rachel said. Erin walked over to a desk in the corner, unlocked a drawer with a key from her pocket, took out a form and said, "Then we file for an emergency accommodation letter this afternoon. It will not stop the landlord, but it will freeze the eviction proceeding until certification is complete. Yolanda will countersign. I will fax it directly to the property management company by 4. She said fax the way a person of her generation said fax, without irony, as if it were still the most reliable technology in the world. Rachel drove home with Ranger's harness on the passenger seat because he had unclipped himself the way Erin had shown her and was curled in the back with his chin on his paws. She did not cry until she was in the parking lot of her own building with the engine off, and then she cried for exactly 3 minutes with her hands on the wheel, and then she wiped her face and picked up her phone and called her sister. "Wendy," she said, "I need you to stop." "Stop what?" Wendy said, in the voice of a woman who had been asked to stop several things in her life and had never once conceded that any of them were happening. "Stop calling Wesley Grant behind my back." There was a pause. "I do not know what you're talking about." He told Yolanda Ruiz that the family fully supports the enforcement of the lease. "The only family member who has spoken to Wesley Grant besides me is you. I need you to stop." Wendy did not respond immediately, and in the silence Rachel understood 2 things simultaneously. The first was that her sister had, in fact, done exactly what Rachel was accusing her of doing. The second was that her sister was not going to admit it. She was going to move sideways, and she was going to make Rachel feel unreasonable for having asked. "Rachel," Wendy said finally, in the soft tone she reserved for family arguments she intended to win, "I love you, and I love Paige, and I love David, and I am watching you make a decision out of grief that you are going to regret for the rest of your life. If I said anything to Wesley Grant, and I'm not saying I did, it would only have been to protect you from a version of yourself that is not thinking clearly." Rachel closed her eyes. "You have to stop, Wendy." "Rachel, be reasonable. You have to stop." "Rachel." Rachel hung up. She sat in the car for another 20 seconds. She looked at Ranger in the rearview mirror. Ranger looked back at her. She said out loud, "That is one." She did not entirely know what she meant. but she wrote it down in a small notebook that night with the date beside it. It was the first entry in a list that would grow longer than she expected. The second entry came 4 days later. Linda Cooper, David's mother, arrived on a Friday afternoon unannounced, which was consistent with the way Linda had always operated. She was a slim, upright woman in her late 60s, silver-haired with a slight Tidewater accent she had never quite shaken, and a habit of arranging the flowers in a room without being asked. She had a spare key to Rachel's apartment from the year David had been on a training rotation in San Diego, and Rachel had needed help with a plumbing emergency. Rachel had never asked for the key back. Linda had never offered. Rachel came in from a walk with Ranger to find Linda in her kitchen putting away a bag of groceries that Rachel had not requested. Ranger did not growl. Ranger did not bark. He walked past Linda without acknowledging her, went to his water bowl, drank, and lay down under the table, which was a thing Rachel had never seen him do with a person he had known for years. "You should have called," Rachel said. "You would have told me not to come," Linda said, which was true and unarguable, and Linda set 2 cartons of blueberries on the counter and turned around and looked at Rachel and said, "I need to talk to you about the dog." "I do not want to talk about the dog." "I know you do not want to talk about the dog. That is why I am here." Rachel let the leash drop on the console table. She sat down at the kitchen table. She put both hands flat on the wood, the way she had done the morning she called Yolanda Ruiz. She said, "Linda, whatever it is, please just say it." Linda sat down across from her. She looked at her own hands for a moment, the wedding band still on her left ring finger, though David's father had been dead for 9 years, and she said, in a voice much smaller than Rachel had ever heard from her, "David sent me a copy of the notebook." The kitchen went very quiet. "He sent me the pages he wrote to you in March. He sent them to me in an envelope, and he said if anything ever happened I should make sure you had found them. He did not want me to give them to you. He wanted me to make sure you had found them yourself. He was very specific about that." Rachel did not speak. "I have been calling you every week to ask about the deployment bag because I have been trying to figure out if you had opened it. I have been trying to figure out if you had found the notebook. Because if you had not found it in another 2 weeks, I was going to have to tell you it existed, and I was going to have to tell you where, and he did not want me to have to do that. He wanted you to find it yourself." Rachel found her voice. "You knew." "I knew." "You knew, and you sat in this apartment 3 weeks ago and told me a dog ranger's size needed land, not a walk-up, and you knew what David had trained him to do." "I knew what David had trained him to do." Linda's hands were folded on the table now. Her knuckles were white. "And I was terrified you were going to fall in love with the idea of keeping the dog for the wrong reason. I was terrified you were going to keep him because he was the last piece of David, and I was afraid that when he died, and he will die, Rachel, dogs die, you were going to lose David all over again. I did not want you to have to lose David twice. That was not your decision to make. I know that. That was not your decision to make. I know that, Rachel." Linda's eyes were wet now. "I am telling you because I know that. I am telling you because I have been trying to figure out how to tell you for a month. And I could not do it on the phone, and I could not do it at the funeral, and I am doing it now, badly, in your kitchen, because you deserve to know what I knew and when I knew it." Rachel stared at the woman across the table from her, at the tidy silver hair, at the cardigan Linda had folded once at each cuff. She thought about the phone calls. She thought about the boarding kennel in Suffolk. She thought about the version of the last 6 weeks in which she had already put Ranger in a truck. "Get out of my kitchen," Rachel said, not unkindly. "Please, I need you to go home now. I love you. Please go." Linda went. She stood at the door for a moment, as if she might say one more thing, and then she did not. Rachel locked the door behind her. She went back to the table. She wrote in the small notebook, "Second entry." Linda knew. She underlined the second word twice. Ranger came out from under the table and put his chin on her thigh. Rachel let her hand rest on his skull. She thought about how many people had known things about her life that she herself had not been told. She thought about how many of them had decided on her behalf what she was allowed to carry. She thought, without deciding it exactly, that the days of that being possible were about to end. She was not wrong. The third entry in the notebook came the following Tuesday, and it came from a man she had not expected to see again for at least a year. Marcus Delaney had been David's swim buddy since sniper school. They had gone through the pipeline together, been on the same team for 4 straight rotations, been at each other's weddings, been godfathers to each other's children. Marcus was a stocky man in his mid-30s with a shaved head and a Saint Christopher medal on a stainless steel chain, and a laugh that filled whatever room he stood in. He had been the pallbearer directly behind the flag at David's funeral, and he had not been able to look at Rachel afterward, and Rachel had understood that, and let him go without pushing him for a conversation he was not ready to have. He knocked on her door at 7 in the evening on the Tuesday of the second week of the countdown. He was in civilian clothes, jeans and a dark green Henley, and he was holding a manila envelope in one hand and a bakery box in the other. Paige was on the couch watching a cartoon. Ranger came to the door before Rachel did and stood at attention in a way Rachel had rarely seen a dog do outside of a working demonstration. Marcus set the bakery box down on the floor of the hallway and knelt and put his forehead against Ranger's forehead and stayed there for 10 full seconds. Ranger did not move. When Marcus stood up, his eyes were red. "He remembers me," Marcus said. "Of course he remembers you," Rachel said. "Come in." Marcus set the bakery box on the counter. He set the envelope on the counter beside it. He looked at the envelope for a moment as if it was something that had bitten him, and then he looked at Rachel and he said, "I need to talk to you about something, and I do not know how to do it without doing it wrong, so I am going to do it wrong. Is that okay?" Rachel said, "Yes." Marcus said, "The story we told you about how David died is not the whole story. It is not a lie, but it is not the whole story." Rachel sat down at the kitchen table for the 3rd time that month with both palms flat. Marcus sat down across from her. He did not touch the envelope. He said, "You were told that David was killed in an extraction under fire. That is true. He was on the last helicopter off. What you were not told is that he was not supposed to be on the last helicopter. He was supposed to be on the second one. He gave his seat to a 19-year-old corpsman named Tommy Reyes, who had been shot in the abdomen at the tree line about an hour before. There was one seat left when the second bird lifted, and it was David's, and he put Tommy in it and stayed for the last bird. The last bird took a round through the tail rotor on liftoff and had to set back down about 400 meters from the extraction point. David and 2 other guys held the perimeter for 11 minutes while the crew chief got the rotor patched enough to fly. David was hit at minute 9. He did not go down. He held his position until the bird was in the air and the 2 other guys had extracted, and then he sat down. That is when they got him. Rachel, he saved 4 men that day. Tommy Reyes is going to walk his daughter down the aisle in 6 years because of David. And the reason the Navy did not tell you all of that at the door is not because they were hiding it. It is because they cannot officially release those details for 18 months, while the after action is under review. But I promised David I would tell you if it came to it. So I am telling you." Rachel did not cry. She sat very still. She listened to the refrigerator hum. She listened to Paige on the couch in the next room laughing at something on the television, a small, clear sound, the sound of a child who did not yet know any of what Rachel was learning. She looked at Marcus. She said, "What is in the envelope?" Marcus pushed the envelope across the table without opening it. "He gave me this to hold before we deployed. He told me if anything happened, I was to bring it to you in person, not mail it, not through the Navy, in person. I have not opened it. I do not know what is in it. I only know that it was important enough that he made me swear on my daughter's name I would deliver it directly into your hand." Rachel looked at the envelope. She looked at Marcus. She looked at Ranger, who had come to sit against her right side and was leaning his shoulder into her hip in the way Erin had said was his settle. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single letter, 3 pages, handwritten in the same tight square that had filled the notebook. There was a photocopy of a legal document with an official seal in the top corner, and there was a small key, brass, with the number 412 etched on the side. Rachel read the letter first. David wrote that if she was reading this, then things had gone the way both of them had always known things could go, and he was sorry. He wrote that he had been putting money aside for 2 years into an account she did not know about. He wrote that the account was in her name and Paige's name jointly, and that the amount, as of the date of the letter, was $142,000. He wrote that it was in a small credit union in Norfolk, and that the photocopy in the envelope was the account authorization, and that the key opened a safe deposit box at the same credit union that contained a physical copy of the will, a life insurance policy she had not been aware of, and the deed to a small piece of land his grandfather had left him in Chesapeake, 3.4 acres, cleared and fenced, with a well and a septic tank already in place. He wrote that he had been planning to surprise her when he came home from this deployment. He had been planning to walk her out onto the land, hand her the deed, and tell her that Later had arrived. He wrote that if she was reading this instead, then Later had not arrived. But the land was still hers, and Paige's and Ranger's, and that if she ever needed to be reminded that the future they had planned had been a real future that he had built with his hands, all she had to do was drive out to a road called Mount Pleasant, past the tree with the split trunk, past the mailbox painted like a bluebird, and turn in at the driveway with the crushed shell. At the end of the letter he wrote, "Do not let anyone talk you out of the dog. He was the first thing I built for the after. The land was the second." Rachel put the letter down on the table. She put both hands over her face. She stayed like that for a long time. Marcus did not move. Ranger did not move. Paige, in the other room, laughed again at something on the television, and the small, clear sound of it went through Rachel like a needle. After a while, she took her hands down and picked up the key and held it in her palm and closed her fingers around it. It was warm from her own hand. It felt heavier than a small brass key had any right to feel. "I need you to do something for me," she said to Marcus. "Anything. I need you to come with me tomorrow to the credit union. I need to open that box. I do not want to do it alone. And I need someone there who knew him. Not a lawyer, not my sister. You. I will be here at 8. "Thank you." Marcus stood up. He put his hand on Ranger's head briefly, formally, the way one soldier salutes another. He left the bakery box on the counter, which turned out to be a dozen molasses cookies from a place in Ghent that David had loved, and he let himself out. Rachel sat at the table for a long time after that, with the key in her palm and the letter beside her and the notebook, where she had been keeping her list of entries open on her knee. She wrote, "Third entry, David built the after." She stared at the words. She erased them. She wrote instead, "Third entry, Later is still coming." She underlined it once. She did not know yet that the safe deposit box would contain, in addition to what David had described, a 4th item, a sealed envelope addressed to Linda in David's handwriting, with the words to be opened only if Rachel decides written across the flap. Rachel would not decide what to do with that envelope for another 11 days. She did not know yet that Wesley Grant, the landlord, was going to show up at her door in person on the following Thursday with a sheriff's deputy and an attempt to serve papers, and that the sheriff's deputy, a woman named Officer Dolores Hayes, who had done 2 tours in the Navy Reserve, was going to recognize the therapy dog vest Ranger was wearing and quietly explain to Wesley Grant that he could not, in fact, serve those papers today, and that if he tried again before the certification was complete, she would be personally interested in the paperwork he brought. She did not know yet that her sister Wendy was going to make one final phone call, this one to the property management company's regional office, and that the call would be recorded, and that a copy of the recording would end up in Rachel's inbox 8 days later, because the compliance officer who received the call happened to be a woman who had lost her own husband to a training accident in 1998 and had zero patience for anyone attempting to interfere with a Gold Star family's housing. She did not know yet that Paige was going to wake up in the middle of the night on the Thursday after Marcus's visit, walk out to the living room, sit down on the floor next to Ranger's water bowl, and tell the dog, out loud, that she had known for 2 weeks that her father was not coming home, but that she had not wanted to say it to her mother because her mother's face got small and quiet whenever anyone mentioned it, and that Ranger was going to have to promise not to leave, and that Ranger, who had come out of the bedroom without a sound and lain down beside her, was going to press his chest against her legs and breathe the 4-2-6 pattern until the girl fell asleep against his side on the hallway floor, where Rachel would find them both at 6 in the morning, and would not wake either of them for 20 minutes because she could not bring herself to move a scene that was healing something she had not been able to reach herself. She did not know yet that the home evaluation for Ranger's certification was going to be conducted by a soft-spoken man named Warren Alexander, who had personally trained 31 service dogs for the Navy over 11 years. And that Warren was going to walk into her apartment, watch Ranger for exactly 7 minutes, and turn to Rachel and say, "Ma'am, this dog is more certified than most of my finished dogs. Sign here." She did not know yet that when she finally drove out to Mount Pleasant Road, past the tree with the split trunk, past the mailbox painted like a bluebird, and turned in at the driveway with the crushed shell, Paige in the back seat, and Ranger in the way back, she was going to find a hand-painted wooden sign nailed to a post at the front of the property that David had put up 2 years earlier without telling her, and that the sign was going to say, in his tight square handwriting, "The Cooper Place, established for later." She did not know yet that later was going to arrive on a Saturday in early July, 3 days after the certification card was mailed, and that the eviction was going to be dismissed with prejudice, and that Wesley Grant was going to be quietly fined by the county rental board for filing enforcement actions against a service animal, and that Wendy was going to send a letter of apology that Rachel would not open for 6 months, and that Linda was going to be given the sealed envelope David had left for her, and that whatever was written inside it was going to make Linda call Rachel and cry on the phone for 40 minutes, and then ask in a small voice if she could come out to the land some Saturday and help plant a row of dogwoods along the driveway. She did not know any of that yet. That night, the night Marcus left, she only knew that the key was in her palm, and Ranger was against her hip, and the notebook was on her knee, and Paige was in the next room laughing at something on the television, and later, which had been a word she had stopped believing in 6 weeks earlier, had just walked back into her kitchen and set a bakery box on the counter and said, "I promised him I would tell you." She stood up. She put the key in the drawer beside the phone. She went to the couch and sat down beside Paige and pulled the girl against her side and kissed the top of her head. Paige leaned into her without looking up from the television. Ranger came and lay down at their feet. He put his chin on Rachel's ankle. He breathed the 4-2-6 pattern. Rachel copied him without knowing. The credit union was on Colley Avenue, in a squat brick building that looked more like a dentist's office than a bank. Marcus was waiting in the parking lot at 7:55 in a plain white t-shirt and jeans. He held the door for Rachel and did not say anything on the walk to the counter. The teller was a woman in her 60s named Cheryl, who took one look at Rachel's ID and the letter of authorization David had left and disappeared into a back office for 6 minutes. When she came back, she had the manager with her, a thin man named Anthony who wore a bow tie and had watery blue eyes, and shook Rachel's hand with both of his hands. "Ma'am," he said, "your husband set this account up with our office personally. He came in every 2 weeks for the last 2 years. He was very specific about the arrangements. If you are ready, I will take you back." The safe deposit box room smelled like paper and metal and old carpet. Anthony led her to box number 412, turned his key in the top lock, stepped back, and let her turn hers in the bottom. The drawer slid out on smooth rails. Marcus stayed by the door with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at his own boots, giving her the privacy of pretending not to be there. Inside the box was a leather folio. Rachel opened it on the small table in the corner of the room. There was, as David had said, the will, signed and witnessed and notarized on a date 2 months before his last deployment. There was a life insurance policy from a private carrier, separate from the Navy's, in the amount of $350,000, with Rachel as sole beneficiary. There was the deed to the 3.4 acres on Mount Pleasant Road, transferred out of David's grandfather's estate into a joint tenancy with right of survivorship in Rachel's name. There was a spiral-bound folder that turned out to contain building permits, well and septic inspection reports, and a set of blueprints for a small, single-story house that David had commissioned from an architect in Norfolk. The blueprints were annotated in David's handwriting. In the master bedroom, along the exterior wall, he had drawn an arrow to a spot beneath the window and written the words, "Cedar mat for R." At the bottom of the folio, there was one more envelope. It was a plain white business envelope, sealed, and it had Linda's name written across the front in David's tight square hand. Across the flap he had written, "To be opened only if Rachel decides." Rachel picked up the envelope. She held it in both hands. She turned it over. She looked at Marcus. Marcus was still looking at his boots. "Do you know what this is?" she said. Marcus looked up. He looked at the envelope. He shook his head slowly. "I do not know what is in it," he said, "but he mentioned something to me once. He said his mother had been telling him for years that Rachel was not strong enough for the life he had chosen. He said his mother had said it more than once, in more than one context. He said he did not agree with her, and he had told her so, and she had not stopped saying it. He said if anything ever happened to him, he wanted his mother to know exactly what she had been wrong about." Rachel closed her fingers around the envelope. She did not open it. She put it back in the folio. She closed the folio. She put the folio back in the drawer. She turned her key. She stood up. "Not today," she said. "Not today," Marcus agreed. They walked out to the parking lot together in the bright June sun. Marcus opened the car door for her the way he opened doors for his wife. Before he closed it, he put his hand on the top of the frame and leaned down slightly and said, "Rachel, whatever you decide about that envelope, he would have wanted you to decide it clear-headed. Not angry, not sad, clear. Whatever you decide is what he would have wanted." She nodded. She started the car. She sat with her hands on the wheel for a moment. Then she looked up at him through the open window and said, "Marcus, do you know a good real estate lawyer?" Marcus smiled for the first time since he had knocked on her door the evening before. It was a small, crooked smile that did not reach his eyes, but was warm anyway. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I know a very good one. My wife. I will have her call you." Marcus's wife was a woman named Priya Delaney, and she called Rachel that same afternoon at 3. She spoke in the fast, measured cadence of a lawyer who had learned to be gentle with grieving clients without pretending they were fragile. She asked practical questions. She listened to the answers. She said the deed was clean, the transfer was clean, the joint tenancy was clean, and the property could not be touched by anyone in any circumstance she could think of, up to and including bankruptcy, which was not on the table. She said she could have the closing paperwork on the credit union account processed in 48 hours. She said the life insurance carrier would need a certified copy of the death certificate and would issue the check within 30 days of receipt, which meant Rachel could reasonably expect the funds by the middle of August. Then Priya paused, and Rachel could hear a pen tapping on a desk, and Priya said, "One more thing. Marcus told me about the envelope for your mother-in-law. I want to be clear that whether you deliver that envelope is entirely up to you, and whatever you decide, I will support you. But I would gently suggest that you not decide today, or tomorrow, or the day after. Give yourself 2 weeks. Whatever is in that envelope has been true for years. It can wait 2 weeks." Rachel said, "Thank you, Priya." Priya said, "Marcus loved him too. Please let us help." Rachel hung up. She sat on the couch. Paige was in her room drawing with a set of colored pencils Marcus had brought in the bakery box last night, which Rachel had only just noticed. Ranger was under the coffee table with his chin on his paws. She wrote in the small notebook, "4th entry, David built the house too." She was going to keep coming back to that entry for weeks. Every time she read it, she was going to understand a different piece of it. Wesley Grant knocked on the door at 9:17 in the morning on the Thursday following the credit union visit. Rachel was in her kitchen making Paige's lunch for the day. Paige had already been dropped off at summer camp by Marcus, who had insisted on doing the drop-off because he was going that way anyway to bring donuts to the recruiter's office, which was not on the way at all. Ranger was on his mat by the front door in his blue harness. Rachel had gotten in the habit of leaving the harness on him at home now because it had become a kind of statement she made to herself. The knock was sharp, 3 raps, and it was followed by the sound of a second person clearing their throat in the hallway. Ranger stood up but did not bark. Rachel wiped her hands on a dish towel and opened the door. Wesley Grant was on the landing in a short-sleeved dress shirt and a tie clip. Behind him was a woman in the tan uniform of the Virginia Beach Sheriff's Office, a folder tucked under her arm, her expression neutral. Wesley Grant said, "Mrs. Cooper, this officer is here to serve you papers. I want to be respectful of your situation, but I have given you every reasonable opportunity to bring your household into compliance with the lease, and you have not done so." The sheriff's deputy was Officer Dolores Hayes. She was in her early 40s, black, with her hair braided close to her scalp under her patrol cap, and she was looking not at Rachel and not at Wesley Grant, but at Ranger, at the blue harness with the patch on the side that said in white block letters, "Psychiatric Service Dog, do not distract." Officer Hayes said, without looking at Wesley Grant, "Mr. Grant, can I see the paperwork?" Wesley Grant handed her a manila envelope. Officer Hayes opened it, glanced at the contents, and glanced up at Rachel. "Mrs. Cooper, do you have your accommodation letter?" Rachel said, "Yes, ma'am. I have the emergency accommodation letter from the Little Creek Family Support Office, dated the 9th of this month. My dog's full certification is expected to be issued in the next 4 to 7 days. My attorney has been notified. I can have all of that documentation on your table in 3 minutes." Officer Hayes said, "Take your time." She turned to Wesley Grant. "Mr. Grant, step over here with me, please." She walked him 3 steps down the hall, out of earshot but not out of sight, and she spoke to him for exactly 1 minute and 40 seconds in a voice too low for Rachel to hear. Wesley Grant's face went through 3 distinct phases, each smaller than the last. When Officer Hayes handed the envelope back to him, unstamped and unserved, his shoulders had dropped almost 2 inches. He walked past Rachel's door without meeting her eye and went down the stairs at a brisk pace. Officer Hayes came back to Rachel's door and knocked once on the frame softly. "Ma'am," she said, "just for the record, my husband was in the reserve for 11 years. My cousin was in the Marines. I have zero patience for anyone attempting to interfere with a Gold Star family. If Mr. Grant returns with any documentation before your certification is on file, you have my card. You call me directly." She handed Rachel a business card. "That is my personal cell, not the switchboard." Rachel took the card. Her hand was steady. She said, "Thank you." Officer Hayes said, "Thank you for your husband's service." She looked down at Ranger, and her face softened in a way that had nothing to do with policy. "And thank you for keeping his dog. That is a whole dog right there." She left. Rachel closed the door. She locked it. She stood with her back against it for a moment. She looked at Ranger. Ranger looked at her. She said, "Fourth." She wrote in the notebook, "Fourth entry, Officer Hayes." She did not know yet that Officer Hayes was going to become a friend, and that a year later Officer Hayes was going to bring her own dog, a rescue with mismatched eyes named Biscuit, out to the Cooper place for a weekend Rachel would host for military widows and their animals. But she wrote the name down, and she meant it. The certification card came on the following Tuesday. It was a small laminated rectangle with Ranger's photograph on the front and Rachel's name on the back and a raised federal seal in the corner. Rachel put it in the pocket of her purse, the way David had put his ID card in the pocket of his uniform, close to her hip, ready to be shown, ready to end an argument before it started. She showed it to Wesley Grant when he sent his final certified letter of intent to terminate, which had been mailed before Officer Hayes had spoken to him and had crossed her showing of the certification in the mail. The letter went in the recycling. She emailed a photograph of the front and back of the certification card, together with the emergency accommodation letter, the home evaluation, the trainer's sign-off, and Priya's cover letter, to the regional office of the property management company. She copied Officer Hayes on the email. She copied Yolanda Ruiz on the email. She copied a woman named Sonia Bernstein at the Fair Housing Office, whose name Priya had suggested for the copy line specifically to make a point. Wesley Grant did not respond. Wesley Grant would not respond for 11 more days, at which point his response would be a 2-line email withdrawing the intent to terminate and asking Rachel to consider his previous correspondence in light of the new documentation. Rachel would not respond to that email at all. She would forward it to Priya, who would send back a one-word reply, "Perfect." But before any of that came the recording. The recording arrived in Rachel's inbox on a Wednesday morning at 11:11 from a woman named Meredith Yun at the Property Management Regional Office. The subject line said, "For your awareness." The body of the email said, "Mrs. Cooper, I am forwarding you a call that was made to my office regarding your account. I believe you should hear it. My condolences on your loss. Monsieur Yun." There was an audio file attached. Rachel played it on her laptop with her earbuds in, standing at the kitchen counter. She heard her own sister's voice. "Yes, I'm calling about the Cooper account at 1947 Great Neck Road. I am Rachel Cooper's sister, and I need to make sure that your office is aware that our family is fully supportive of enforcing the lease terms as written. My sister is not in a mental state to be making housing decisions. She has been through a significant trauma, and she is clinging to that animal for reasons that are not rational. If your office proceeds with the eviction, no one in our family will contest it. In fact, several members of our family would consider it a favor to my sister. She needs to be forced out of that apartment for her own good. She will thank you later." The recording ended. Rachel stood at the kitchen counter. She did not move. She did not breathe. She listened to the small, clean silence that follows a recording ending in earbuds, the very slight hiss of nothing. She took the earbuds out. She put them on the counter. She put her hands on the counter, palms flat, the way she had learned to do. She stood like that for a long time. Then she called Priya. Priya listened to the recording. Priya said, "Send me a written statement. I will draft a cease and desist letter. Your sister will receive it by Friday. It will not have teeth beyond a certain point, but it will make the point loudly enough." Rachel said, "I want more than a letter." Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want?" Rachel said, "I want to sit down with her. I want you in the room. I want the recording on the table. I want her to hear herself. I want her to know I heard her. I do not want to yell. I do not want a scene. I want her to understand, in a room with a witness, that this is over, that she does not speak on my behalf ever again, not to a landlord, not to my mother-in-law, not to Page's school, not to anyone, ever." Priya said, "I can set that up for Saturday morning. Neutral location. My conference room, since it is a family matter and a courthouse would feel like an attack." Rachel said, "Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. She hung up. She wrote in the small notebook. She wrote 5th entry, the recording. She wrote 6th entry, Saturday. Saturday came slowly and quickly at the same time. Rachel dropped Page off at Marcus and Priya's house for the morning, where Page and Marcus's 8-year-old daughter, Lila, had already made plans to build a fort out of couch cushions. Rachel drove to Priya's office in Ghent in the car Marcus had loaned her, because her own car was in the shop for a battery replacement. Ranger was in the passenger seat because Priya had said quietly, "Bring him. It will help you. It will also make a statement." Wendy was in the conference room when they arrived. She was in a lavender cardigan, her hair pulled back, her hands folded on the table in front of her the way she folded them at church. She looked up when Rachel came in with Ranger at her hip, and her whole face changed in a way Rachel did not entirely have language for. It was not just surprise. It was not just discomfort. It was the very specific expression of a person seeing for the first time that the sister she had been managing for 4 decades had come into the room in a way that was not going to be managed today. Priya sat down. She had a small digital recorder on the table already. She turned it on. She stated the date and time and everyone's names and the reason for the meeting in a calm, professional voice. Then she nodded at Rachel. Rachel said, "Wendy, before I say anything, I want you to know that I love you. I have loved you my whole life. Nothing that happens in this room today is going to change that. Do you understand me?" Wendy said, "Yes." Rachel said, "I have a recording of a phone call you made on the 18th to the regional office of my landlord's property management company. Priya is going to play it. I want you to listen to it. After it plays, I'm going to say what I need to say. Then you may respond. Do you agree?" Wendy said, "Rachel, I do not know what you are talking about." Priya played the recording. Wendy's face did not change while the recording played. She kept her hands folded on the table. She looked at the recorder. When it finished, she looked up at Rachel. She said in a low voice, "Rachel, that was said in a moment when I was very worried about you." Rachel said, "I'm sure it was." Wendy said, "You have to understand." Rachel said, "I do not. I do not have to understand. I have understood you for 40 years, and I'm going to stop understanding you for a little while, and I'm going to just talk. You have called my landlord behind my back at least twice. You told him that our family fully supports the enforcement of a lease that would evict a widow and a 7-year-old and a service dog. You told a stranger in a regional office that I am not mentally competent to make housing decisions. You have not offered once in 6 weeks to sit with me. You have not offered once to help me pack a box, sort a drawer, drive Page to camp, take out my trash, bring me a meal I did not have to reheat. What you have offered is opinions. And what you have done when your opinions were not accepted is go behind my back and try to arrange the outcome you wanted." Wendy opened her mouth. Rachel raised her hand. "I'm not done. I want you to know that I am not angry the way you think I am angry. I am not going to yell. I am not going to fight with you at Thanksgiving. I love you and I love your boys and I love Craig. But you do not speak on my behalf ever again. Not to a landlord, not to Linda, not to Paige's school, not to a doctor, not to a neighbor, not to a friend, not to a bank, not to a realtor, not to God. You do not speak for me. You may speak to me. You may speak to me anytime you want, about anything you want, and I will listen the way a sister listens. But if you speak for me again, in any context, I will find out, and there will be a consequence. And the consequence will be that I will not speak to you for 1 year. Do you understand me? Wendy said in a very small voice. Rachel. Rachel said, do you understand me? Wendy said, yes. Rachel said, thank you. Priya turned off the recorder. There was a long moment of silence in the conference room. The air conditioning cycled on. Ranger, who had been lying at Rachel's feet the entire time, stood up slowly and walked around the table and put his head against Wendy's knee. Wendy looked down. Her hand went, without her deciding, to the top of the dog's head. She began quietly to cry. Ranger did not move. He stood against her knee and let her cry. After a while, Wendy said, without looking up, I am so sorry. Rachel said, I know you are. Wendy said, I did not know what to do with how much I was watching you hurt. Rachel said, I know you did not. Wendy said, I thought if I could just get you out of that apartment. Rachel said, I know what you thought. Wendy said, it is not an excuse. Rachel said, no, it is not. They sat like that for a while, sisters at a conference room table with a dog between them, and then Wendy dried her eyes on the sleeve of her cardigan and looked up at Rachel and said, what can I do? Rachel said, you can drive out to the land with me next Saturday. There is a fence that needs mending on the east side. Craig knows fences. Bring him, bring the boys, bring a cooler. Wendy nodded. She said, we will be there. They stood up. They did not hug. They would hug later, eventually, on a different Saturday, in a different room. Today was not that day, and neither of them pretended it was. Rachel held the door open for Wendy. Wendy walked out to the parking lot. Rachel watched her go. Priya said quietly, that was well done. Rachel said, it did not feel well done. Priya said, it rarely does. Rachel drove home with Ranger on the passenger seat. She sat in the parking lot of her building with the engine off for 2 minutes. Then she went upstairs, opened the drawer beside the phone, took out the small brass key, and put it in her pocket. She got back in the car. She drove to Linda's house. Linda answered the door in her Saturday clothes, a plain white blouse and khaki pants, and her face did the small, hopeful thing it had been doing since the day she had come to Rachel's kitchen and confessed about the notebook, a hope she was not permitting herself to hold on to. Rachel said, I need to give you something. May I come in? Linda stepped back. Rachel came in. She did not sit down. She took the sealed envelope from the credit union out of her bag and held it out to Linda. David left this for you. He gave it to me to decide whether to give to you. I have decided to give it to you. I have not read it. I do not want to know what is in it. That is between you and him. Linda took the envelope with both hands. She looked down at it. Her hands were trembling very slightly. She said, Rachel. Rachel said, you do not need to tell me what he wrote. You do not need to tell me anything about it. I just wanted you to have it. Linda said, Rachel, I am so sorry for what I said to you about the boarding kennel. Rachel said, I know you are. I forgave you for it in the credit union parking lot on Tuesday. I did not know I had forgiven you until just now, standing here. I am telling you so you can put it down. Linda began to cry. Rachel let her cry for a moment. Then Rachel said gently, I am going home now. I love you. When you have read it, and if you want to talk about anything in it, you can call me or not. It is up to you. She turned. She walked out. Linda did not follow her. Linda called her at 9 that night and cried on the phone for 40 minutes and asked, in a small voice, if she could come out to the land some Saturday and help plant a row of dogwoods along the driveway. Rachel said yes. Linda said thank you. Rachel said David would have wanted them there anyway. She hung up. She wrote in the notebook, 7th entry, the envelope. 8th entry, dogwoods. The move to Mount Pleasant Road happened in stages over the second half of July and the first half of August. The check from the private life insurance policy cleared on the 12th of August, exactly 30 days after Priya had submitted the certified death certificate, and the check paid for the house to be started. The blueprints David had commissioned went to a small builder in Chesapeake who had, it turned out, gone to high school with David, and who cried when he saw the annotations in David's handwriting and said he would not take a dime over cost, and Rachel would have to physically restrain him from working weekends without pay. Rachel let him take 5% over cost anyway because Priya said she should, and the builder cried again and did not argue. Marcus came out to the land every Saturday to work on the fence with Craig. Craig, it turned out, was a very good man who had been told by his wife for years that Rachel was fragile and had been surprised to discover over 3 consecutive Saturdays with a post-hole digger that Rachel could operate a post-hole digger and knew what a batterboard was and could read a level. Craig started to look at Rachel the way people look at other people whose stereotypes have collapsed pleasantly, and by the end of the 3rd Saturday, he and Rachel had settled into the easy shared silence of 2 people who both knew how to use their hands. Wendy brought the boys and the cooler. Linda brought lemonade in a glass pitcher and a set of dogwood saplings. Paige rode the tractor with the neighbor from down the road, a widower in his 70s named Roy Hendricks, whose farm bordered the Cooper place, and who had adopted Paige as an honorary granddaughter within about 17 minutes of meeting her. Ranger supervised. He supervised the way he did everything quietly from a specific vantage point, with his eyes on Rachel and Paige at all times. When Paige was on the tractor with Roy, Ranger sat at the corner of the pasture where he could see both the tractor and the porch. When Rachel was on the porch, Ranger was on the porch. When Rachel got up to fetch a hammer, Ranger got up. When Rachel sat down on the porch swing at the end of a long day and put her head back against the chain, Ranger came and lay across her feet and did the 4-2-6 pattern without being asked, and Rachel copied him without knowing. The memorial at Little Creek was on the last Saturday in August. It was a small ceremony, closed to press, held in a chapel on the base where David had been baptized as an infant when his father was stationed there in the 1960s. The uniform was displayed in a shadow box on a table at the front of the chapel, medals arranged the way David would have wanted, flags folded, the shape of him made visible in the specific negative space that a folded uniform draws around a missing chest. Rachel wore black, Paige wore navy blue, which was Paige's decision, and which Paige explained had been chosen because it was the closest color to what her father had worn. Ranger wore his blue harness with the certification patch on the side. He walked with Rachel down the aisle. He sat at her feet during the entire service, absolutely still, absolutely quiet, his eyes on the shadow box, his weight against her calf. The chaplain who conducted the service was Kenneth Boyle, the same man who had come to Rachel's door on the morning of the 2nd Tuesday in May. He said the correct words in the correct order. Marcus spoke. Tommy Reyes, the corpsman David had put in the seat, came up in a wheelchair and said in a voice that broke twice that he was going to name his son David if he ever had one, and that if he did not have a son, he would name his daughter Davis. 2 other men from David's team spoke. Linda spoke briefly and quoted a line from the envelope David had written to her that Rachel did not recognize, but that made Linda's voice steady when she said it. Rachel did not speak. She had told Chaplain Boyle in advance that she would not be able to, and he had nodded and told her that not speaking was itself a form of speaking, and that no one in the chapel would misunderstand it. At the end of the service, Chaplain Boyle asked those gathered to stand for the final blessing. Everyone stood. Ranger stood. He looked up at Rachel once, checked her face, and then turned his head toward the shadow box at the front of the chapel and did something Rachel had not seen him do before. He walked, without being led, up the center aisle. He walked slowly, at the pace of a working dog on a job, and he stopped in front of the shadow box. He sat down. He looked at the uniform. He lay down. He put his chin on his paws. He stayed. The chapel went completely quiet. Chaplain Boyle looked at Rachel. Rachel nodded, one small nod, giving permission for whatever came next. Chaplain Boyle did not say anything. He waited. Everyone waited. Ranger stayed at the foot of the shadow box for a full minute. Then he stood up, turned around, and walked back down the aisle, and sat down at Rachel's feet, and put his chin on her thigh. There was no dry eye in the chapel. Later, when the reception was in the fellowship hall, and there were casseroles on the folding tables, and Paige was eating a cookie the size of her face with Lila Delaney, an older man in a rumpled suit approached Rachel where she was standing by the window with a paper cup of punch. He was in his 70s, thin, with a white mustache and a navy pin in his lapel. He said, "Mrs. Cooper, my name is Harold Preston. I served with your husband's grandfather. I promised your husband something the last time I saw him at Christmas, and I've been trying to figure out how to keep the promise. May I have a moment?" Rachel said yes. Harold Preston took a leather box out of his breast pocket. He opened it. Inside was a silver medallion the size of $50, with a raised anchor and the words, "For service rendered," engraved around the rim. Harold said, "This was your husband's grandfather's. Your husband gave it to me 2 years ago and asked me to hold it. He said if anything ever happened to him, he wanted it delivered to his daughter in person on the day of his memorial. He said it was time it went to the next generation. He said his daughter was going to be brave, and she was going to need something in her pocket for the days that were hard, and that this had been in his grandfather's pocket for 40 years, and it was still warm." Rachel took the box. She did not trust herself to speak. Harold nodded once, small and dignified, and turned to walk away. He turned back. "Ma'am," he said, "your husband was one of the finest young men I ever met, and I have met many." He walked away. Rachel crossed the fellowship hall to where Paige and Lila were building a small castle out of the wrapped mints from the reception table. She knelt down. She said, "Paige, there is a man over there who knew your dad's grandfather. He brought you something your dad wanted you to have." Paige stood up. She walked with Rachel across the room. Harold Preston knelt down to Paige's height. He handed her the box. He said, "Your father told me you were the bravest person he knew. He said you would need something for the hard days. He asked me to make sure you got it today." Paige took the box. She opened it. She looked at the medallion. She looked at Harold Preston. She said, in a voice much smaller than her usual voice, "Was he brave too?" Harold said, "Yes, ma'am, he was." Paige said, "Then I will keep it in my pocket like he did." Rachel could not see for a moment. When she could, she saw that Ranger was pressed against her thigh, and that he was breathing the 4-2-6 pattern, and that she was copying him without knowing. The house on Mount Pleasant Road was finished in the middle of October. It was not large. It was 1 story, with a wide front porch that faced east, so the morning sun came in through the kitchen window, and a mudroom off the side door with hooks at Paige's height, and a low cedar bench for Ranger to climb up on when he came in with wet paws. The exterior was clapboard, painted the specific shade of sea glass green David had promised Paige the summer she turned 5. The bedroom Paige chose was the smaller one at the end of the hall, with a window that looked out on the fenced yard, and on the exterior wall beneath the window there was a cedar mat in the exact spot David had drawn the arrow on the blueprint. Ranger slept on the cedar mat. On the nights Paige woke up from bad dreams, and there were many such nights that first year, and fewer such nights the year after, Ranger was already there before she made a sound. He put his head on the edge of her mattress. His tail moved once, steady and sure. He breathed the 4-2-6 pattern. Paige copied him without knowing, and within a minute or two, sometimes within 30 seconds, the girl was asleep again, with her hand tangled in the ruff of fur behind his ear. Rachel put the shadow box with David's uniform in the living room above the fireplace, where the morning light hit the medals in a slow diagonal every day at 7:12. She hung a photograph of David and Ranger on the wall beside it, taken the day David had brought the puppy home from the trainers. David laughing, Ranger's ears too big for his head. On the mantel below the shadow box, she put the small brass key from the safe deposit box, and the notebook with her list of entries in it, and the leather bracelet Paige had made David at day camp the summer before, with the shell still knotted into the cord. Wesley Grant refunded her security deposit in full, which was more than the lease required. Officer Dolores Hayes came out to the housewarming with her dog Biscuit, who Ranger tolerated with the distant patience of a senior dog who has decided he is officially retired from puppy work. Marcus and Priya and Lila came. Wendy and Craig and the boys came. Linda came and brought a set of new dogwood saplings, which she and Rachel planted along the driveway that afternoon, in the specific arrangement David had drawn in the blueprint. 3 on the left side and 4 on the right, spaced 20 feet apart. Roy Hendricks came from the farm down the road and gave Paige a hand-carved wooden owl he had made in his workshop over the summer. Tommy Reyes came in his wheelchair with his fiancée, whose name was Amelia, and who was 6 months pregnant with a daughter they had already decided to name Davis. On the second night in the new house, after everyone had gone home and Paige had fallen asleep in her new room with Ranger on the cedar mat, Rachel walked out onto the porch in David's old grey hoodie and stood at the top of the steps and looked out at the property. The dogwoods were small and thin along the driveway. The moon was up. The fence, mended by Marcus and Craig and Rachel and Roy, ran clean along the east side of the pasture. The sign David had put up 2 years earlier was still nailed to its post at the front of the property, and in the moonlight she could just barely read it. The Cooper Place. Established for later. She sat down on the porch swing. The chains creaked. Ranger, who had followed her out without a sound, jumped up onto the swing beside her and settled his weight against her hip and put his chin on her thigh. He breathed. 4 in, hold for 2, 6 out. Rachel copied him. She did not have to try any more. Her body had learned it the way a body learns to walk. She thought about the morning she had opened her bedroom door and found him lying on David's uniform. She thought about how close she had come to walking out of that room and pretending she had not seen. She thought about the notebook. She thought about the letters. She thought about Yolanda Ruiz and Erin Bishop and Officer Hayes and Marcus and Priya and Linda's tears on the phone and Wendy in the conference room and Tommy Reyes in the chapel and Harold Preston in the fellowship hall. She thought about the 67 days between the morning of the second Tuesday in May and the day the certification card had come in the mail. She thought about the small brass key and the leather bracelet and the hand-painted sign at the end of the driveway and Paige's medallion in Paige's pocket. She thought about David in a tent on the other side of the world in March, writing 4 pages of instructions to a wife he was going to leave a widow, planning the after that he would not live to see, teaching a dog to breathe the 4-2-6 pattern, so that when the wife found the dog on the uniform on the bed, the dog could teach her what he had not been there to teach her himself. She put her hand on top of Ranger's head. "You did what he asked," she said quietly into the dog's warm fur. "You did every single thing he asked." Ranger's tail moved once. The moon was very bright. The dogwoods were very small. The sign at the end of the driveway said, in David's tight square handwriting, that later had been established. And on the porch swing of the house David had built for her, Rachel Cooper sat with her husband's dog and breathed and did not need to walk out of the room anymore. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me while I was telling it, share it with someone who needs to hear that grief can build something, that a good dog can carry a promise across the hardest year of a person's life, and that later, when it comes, is worth the wait. Leave a comment if you cried, tell me what part landed hardest, and subscribe to the channel so you will not miss the next story I sit down to tell you. From my kitchen table to yours, thank you for listening.